about the new rules of PR. And this is a topic I've wanted to do for a long time because you get the sense, and I think people, if you work in the industry, that things are changing. You have a sense for how they're changing. You have a sense for, like, we used to use old metrics. What are new metrics? We used to do, kind of editorial plans or pitch plans or sort of PR roadmaps in this way, and it's sort of a little bit different. And we have a sense that if you're on the front lines of doing PR every day, that the value that we bring is changing. And suddenly, there's other ways that we can add value. There's a sense, certainly now during, kind of COVID-19 time in the pandemic, that there's such a big news story that sort of is pervasive everywhere, that changes the dynamic of things. And the fact that you can do, of course, a national TV interview sitting from, a chair at home when they would have wanted you in studio before. So there's a lot of factors that go into this, and a lot of factors that kind of change the way we think about PR, and I think give us a new set of rules. So the goal today is to talk about those and actually talk about some of the questions you need to ask yourself that changes just how you think about the subject of PR. And then to go over 5 core rules as a starting point that will sort of point us in the right direction for how all of us who are either, and probably people watching today are either, you're PR professionals, so you do this every day. You're marketing professionals, so PR is one of your, weapons in your toolkit, or your leadership, your managers, your founders, and you're like, okay, I need to leverage this. I need to know more about this. So we're going to talk about how the new rules of PR impact all of you in your day-to-day work. As a little bit of sort of the 60-second version, and I appreciate Jackson, the nice introduction, a little bit about us, and just kind of, I always sort of say, before you take advice from someone, maybe understand their perspective and how they look in the world. So a few things just about me that is, very quick, and maybe some of my unique background. Number one, I got my start in PR, and hopefully you can see the slides on the screen. Is that correct, Jackson? You can see that okay? Yeah. So I got my start in PR because I wrote a book right out of college called How to Go to College Almost for Free, because I was the kid who hustled around and won 2 dozen scholarships with $90,000, went to Harvard for free. And so we sold eventually 2.5 million copies of the book, but at the beginning, we were trying to sell the first 5,000 copies. And I remember them delivered to my parents' garage, and they needed a home. And we started thinking about, how do we generate news and buzz and stories? And I sort of had an intrinsic sense at the time that I couldn't just say, kid writes self-published book, put out a press release and people would get it. So some of my perspective sort of starts with, how do you get a physical thing, time was a physical book, to want to change hands and find a home? So that was kind of the first thing. The second thing was Startup Chile. So some of how I think about the world is really colored by a global perspective. I was the pitch trainer for Startup Chile. It's a global incubator in Santiago, Chile, where startups from 50 plus, now it's probably 75 plus countries around the world come and kind of work on their startups. And I was the guy who looked at their investor pitch deck and helped them work on their elevator pitch, and then ultimately help them do quick PR campaigns in their key markets to get traction, to raise money from investors on more favorable terms. So some of what we're going to talk today is some rules that affect primary media markets like the U.S., but really it affects markets all over the world, and I'll talk about how that works and the new rules work around the world. And then final part about us, and then it's going to all be about the work that you're doing after this, is that as part of TOP, which is our kind of global agency network, there's a number of agencies within TOP. I'm the CEO of each of them, and TOP stands for Test, Optimize, and Perform. And so it's a methodology of how we approach any marketing discipline, and we work across 35 different disciplines, but especially PR too. How do you test in PR? How do you optimize? How do you perform? And these are some of our agencies, and today's presentation is going to really pull from PR Hacker, which is a new kind of viral marketing, data-driven PR agency. And just to give you some perspective, we do campaigns all over the world. We're sort of large, but we're also local. We work in campaigns in 20 plus countries, and some of our clients include, early stage startups and really some of the biggest brands in the world. So with that being said, let's start off as a way to get into these new rules by talking about what are the PR questions we are asking now that we didn't ask before. And if you have more questions about this, you can always, you see in the lower corner of your screen, you can always tweet at me at Benjamin Kaplan. as well. But let's start off with kind of our first sort of question that we sort of used to ask. So the old way was we asked this. We said, what upcoming company news do we have to announce? I mean, to some extent, we still do this a bit, of course, but we really had sort of in the kind of the old sort of regime or the old scheme, really, it was us first. What do we want to say? What do we want to announce? When do we want to announce it? The new way these days is a little bit different. We might ask the question, how can we package some data to create a newsworthy trend? So one of the first ways that kind of we think about PR has changed is it's this tug of war between you, the audience, and me, the company or the brand. And what has really shifted is that we have to start putting the audience first. And it wasn't always like that. I mean, when the first press release was invented by, Ivy Lee more than 100 years ago, it's kind of fun to understand the history of it. It was actually, it was created because he was running communications for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they had a big crash. And suddenly they had to spread the word, what was the official policy of the company, in a really efficient way that everyone understood it. So the first press release was born because it was meant to be a big event, a big brand. What is the company's official position? And so it was much more of a, we distribute to you, a kind of world. And so it makes sense that the press release came from that. Well, what happened now is suddenly in this new world order, it's much more of a two-way conversation. News can come from everywhere. There's a proliferation of media outlets. There's a proliferation of influencers. And so suddenly there's a whole bunch of noise, and it's not just what we say that counts and what we say that matters, because it can get drowned out. So suddenly we have to be relevant to the conversation. Suddenly we have to shift our thinking and put the audience first. And so one of the things we'll talk about later is we start asking questions like, let's package some data, or let's create some news, or let's create something useful, or let's be valuable to the conversation. That's one way things have changed. So here's another old way question. Why were our competitors featured and we were not? Probably, if you're thinking about this, if you're on this webinar, either you probably received this memo or Slack message or email, or you've sent this memo or Slack message or email, where it's, gosh, there's this roundup of the top 5 companies in so-and-so industry, and, we're not there. What happened? What do we do? And the new way is, how can we use our competitors' coverage to slingshot our story? And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but because of the speed of the news cycle, because now suddenly you have articles that can actually be updated because they're online and they can change. It was published, but there's still the next version. Because there's a premium placed on how fast you can respond and how easy you can make things for the journalist and how you can enter the story before the story cycle's even over. Just on the initial reporting of the story, there's a whole set of tools and processes and procedures that actually says what we do and is not a zero-sum game with the others that we may compete against in the business world, but actually we can piggyback on it. We can leverage it. We'll talk some about that, kind of a shift in how we think. Another kind of old way question, which is, what approach should we take to write this pitch? How do we think about this? How do we pitch this story? And you might think, okay, I do some of that today. But because of the speed and because of the need to pitch stories at the kind of pace and kind of scale, and we'll talk about globalization soon, and in many parts of the world at the same time, the new way is, which blueprint should we leverage to best tell your story? We need a way, and what we call this a PR hacker, or within the sort of the top agency family, is how do we kind of create stories in patterns that journalists can recognize because they understand that pattern to be a story that is useful to them. And so the benefit of that is that it allows us to create stories at scale in real time and jump on news stories faster. And because, they used to say that, kind of CNN invented the sort of 24-hour news cycle. I mean, 24 hours is incredibly slow right now. If you're on a 24-hour news cycle, you're behind the game, entirely. More like 24 minutes. And so some of the systems we need to scale PR have to be different in that kind of environment and that kind of speed. And I'll give you some examples of what some of these PR blueprints look like later. So you can basically base your story creation on patterns that allow you to kind of scale and get out into market with those stories a little bit faster. So I'm going to pause there. Jackson, I just threw in 3 kind of old way, new rules. Do we have some folks either with questions, or Jackson, you do this every day, on sort of how this practically impacts like the work that we do?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have a lot of kind of like rubber hits the road type questions here, and I'll throw them out for you just so that you kind of have them for context, and we can speak to them, I think, sort of as we go. So one of the ones that I'm seeing here that I think is a good question from Laura Newstrom is, just like, is earned PR even possible anymore? She says, it seems it's increasingly becoming pay to play. There are a lot of voices sort of that are vying for earned media attention. And so, like, does buying branded content with a publication help to get earned media later? Should we just start allocating a portion of our budget for paid content? And I think this is a frustration a lot of people like experience, right? Particularly when there's a lot going on in the news cycle.
Okay, sure. And I think the key that I would say here is that earned media is incredibly powerful. And in some ways, it's more powerful than ever before. The difference is we have to earn it, right? And the way that we earn it has shifted. So, when you have a story right now, like the kind of pandemic COVID-19, you've got to find ways to leverage that in some capacity. That doesn't mean you have to have a story that if you're not related to disease or health, that you suddenly have to find a way. It just means that it's such a dominant story in our thinking that to create earned media, we have to be super timely. We have to be, in many cases, super local. In many cases, super relevant. We have to be super fast. We can't pitch what we pitched 2 months ago. We have to pitch what's relevant today. So in that sense, earned media is still a powerful tool. Other forms of media can complement it. And actually, let me not take like a super like US or UK focused approach. The answer to your question actually depends on where you are. US and UK still can drive a tremendous amount of earned media coverage. And in fact, I think there's, you can even drive more because, and we'll talk about the use of data in doing that. But there's places in the world where there's less of a clear wall. So I'll give you an example, China. We do campaigns in China. So in China, what's different is that the contrast with the US. So in the US or UK, in the US or UK, if you're going to go pitch a story, you pitch one person. And if you're going to go buy an ad or do kind of native advertising or do a partnership, a branded partnership, you're going to go talk to another person. China, that's the same person. There's only one person. So the issue becomes, are they putting on their editorial earned media hat or their paid hat? And basically what happens in China is that if you don't have a great story, which might be some great insight, some great data or something interesting, they're going to immediately put on their paid hat. It's going to turn immediately into a paid advertising offering. But if you come in with an interesting story, something of value, something that and even in China, it can still be, when they do a ton of paid for play, it can still be an earned story. So that's a little bit perspective there, but I think what it just has to be is you have to be better at the craft of generating earned media. But to me, this is a golden age. And Jackson, maybe one more quick question, then let me kind of jump back into kind of the next part of this.
Yeah, so I think that this also speaks to like Sydney Mishkin sort of asked a similar question, basically saying, with me, the inbox is so inundated with updates in the restaurant industry, specifically where Sydney works. How do we stand out and garner attention for struggling clients? And also sort of related to that, Sydney wonders, what to do with sort of non-COVID related news or news that might not be like immediately related to the dominant like news narrative.
Okay, sure.
I throw that out there, understanding that this is like very closely related to the last question, but just to understand that like maybe like as we go forward, we can frame up a little bit of how data can help to make these stories like relevant, right, and timely, and cut through the noise.
Correct. And so one of the things that is useful, and we're going to talk about this as kind of one of the new rules, is that things that you can do that make you super valuable to the conversation, that give you a monopoly on information that makes you part of the story. So Jackson talks about data, and this is one really powerful way that's become even more important. And we're going to talk about that maybe a little bit later. But the idea is this: if you have some kind of insight that is driven by sort of, an examination of objective facts in some way, and you're the only person who has that insight, you have to be a part of the story. So some of how PR has changed is, as an agency, we're doing surveys, every week. We're looking at Google Trends data to figure out, which, for instance, here's a real story we did, which US states are most stressed out right now about the whole pandemic and COVID-19. And we just looked at Google Trends for that. We'll look at other sources of data that we'll look at, social media data. We'll look at other things to generate news. So one great way to kind of solve that problem is to use data. And then the second answer to the sort of question about, if we're doing something totally unrelated to the pandemic, totally unrelated to COVID-19, what do we actually do? And the key is that you don't have to have a direct relationship. You just have to have a relationship to the fact that things have sort of changed. So if we look at, let's say in your industry where, growth was 10% last year and this year it's -5%, that's related to COVID-19. That creates something that can be piggybacked on. And now you can talk about we have stories related to how growth turned negative this year and what you need to do about it, right? So it doesn't have to be directly on the facts. It can be around the circumstances. And so in some ways, I actually think this is a great opportunity for companies that have struggled to be relevant before. It's easier now. And the reason it's easier now is because the COVID-19 pandemic and other related stories, whether it's Black Lives Matter or other stories that are kind of pervasive through the news, actually has affected everything to such an extent that suddenly it's given you a way to be relevant to everything. And so I sort of encourage you to think about it like that. So let me jump back in to kind of some of these old way and new way, and I think we'll kind of get to some of the answers to some of these questions. If we kind of go in, I'm going to share my screen again here. And if we look at, and hopefully everyone can see my screen, a few other things. So the old way, relevant to the questions, why aren't journalists showing more interest in this story? New way, which story headline generated the best multivariate test results? So something powerful and practical that you do is we will do multiple versions of a story and test what works. Here's a famous example from kind of the histories of our agency. We have a client that is a marketplace for used gadgets where you can sell your old iPhone. And we did kind of a famous, study, as a viral study that trended all over the world. And the first version of the study said 72% of Americans are gadget hoarders. We created this new term called gadget hoarding because it was sort of the problem that our client could solve through their marketplace for electronics. We did a survey saying, have you, kept a device in your desk drawer for 6 months or more and never used it? That's gadget hoarding. And we asked people if they'd done that. And we got good results on the story. But we A/B tested and multivariate tested that. We tried many other iterations of it. One of the other headlines, we added one other word. So the headline was 72% of Americans are compulsive gadget hoarders. We added the word compulsive. The use of that word increased interest from journalists by 10 times. We had journalists writing us back saying, OMG, you should see my desk drawer. I totally have this disease. And that actual story became one of the first instances of what later became a blueprint for us, which was the disease blueprint, which just means that we give problems a catchy name that helps you to understand it. In this case, it was compulsive gadget hoarding. And then we use that to frame a problem that our client can solve. So one of the big solutions to this is a lot of testing to try different things. And that's why a little bit we'll talk about breaking free of sort of the press release model is helpful because you can test a lot more things faster. Brings us to the last couple of these. Old way. Question was, how come these journalists haven't responded to us? How come we're not getting hits? How come we're not getting traction? New way. When is the best day of week and time of day to pitch each journalist? The first time I ever appeared on CNN, I pitched at 4:32 a.m. on a Wednesday. And the reason was because all of the producers were working then. They were in front of their computers. They were doing, email. And that was the best time to reach them. And no one else was pitching them at that time. So, and actually at the time I was living on the West Coast. These are a lot of like East Coast producers. So I'm basically up at 1:32 a.m. pitching the East Coast. And actually within 10 minutes, I got my first response back from CNN's one of their anchors. Within 7 minutes after that, I got a response back from a producer and I was booked on the show. So one of the things you have to do, because there is certainly a lot of digital noise and a lot of distractions, that's for sure, is that you have to start optimizing your process to reach the right journalist at the right time. Old way. What story or press release will we do next? It's sort of a sequential process where we think we do this for a bit, then we do the next thing for a bit. New way. How can we work parallel across media to get results faster? So one of the things that we really preach at PR Hacker and Top Global is how do we get multiple tracks going at the same time? It's hard to do that when you rely on a press release. I mean, we write a ton of press releases, but we don't rely on them because the problem is a press release for one company, you can't issue 10 press releases on the same day, right? Yeah, it puts you in a sequential path. So what we try to do is get multiple tracks going on at the same time and then start thinking about how do we double down on the stories that are working best? And how do we optimize the stories that are good but not great? And how do we discard the stories that aren't really driving ROI for us? So by working more laterally, we can get faster results. And the old way was, how many impressions did we generate for this media placement? I mean, if you've worked in PR, you for sure know the term impressions. We still deal with impressions every day with our clients because it's one measure people use. But here's the new way. What is the domain authority of the media outlet who link to us? We're going to talk about the link between PR and SEO and why every person who works in PR is going to need SEO, know SEO in the next 5 to 10 years. And every person who works in SEO is going to need to know PR in the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to talk about why those two things are really related, but it has changed the nature of the metrics we track and how we think about it. It doesn't mean we still don't use things like, impressions or share of voice, which I like that as a metric a lot more. We do things like we will look at, maybe the ad equivalency of if we had to buy for the ad. Those are still things we can do. But there's actually this whole new class of other metrics, in particular related to SEO, but there's a few other business kind of factors related to that is the new way of looking at things. And so to be a great PR person, you have to know related fields. And then, so where we're at and where we've gone so far is we said there's kind of an old way and there's a new way and it's changing. It puts a premium on certain things. And now let's talk about, of all those things, what are 5 of the most impactful new rules that really change the way that all of us approach kind of how we do PR. And the first rule relates to the couple questions we've had such far. And feel free to jump in the chat with more questions. And Jackson, feel free to jump in if you want to highlight additional ones as well. And so first new rule is that to get more coverage, package more data. And so data over the past, really, certainly 10 years, but then really like 5 years, 3 years, past year is becoming increasingly important in sort of the PR toolkit. And the reason for that is a few different trends, and I can just kind of put this on the screen. Great data tells a story that is still valuable to others, so it puts them first, yet can ladder back to our brand's core value and positioning. So great data, if we do it well, does both. And let me give you an example of how we're using data in different ways with our clients right now. So one client we have, they are a B2B provider of insights for a lot of retail companies and some restaurants on understanding the dynamics of foot traffic in their store. And so they can give you insight that if you run a digital ad and you're usually optimizing for who clicks on the ad, well, instead of that, optimize who goes in your store. So what we're doing for them right now is we're highlighting, because they do have some insights about, because they have all this aggregate store data about in certain cities, how busy are the stores, how many people there, and you can realize that that is actually tangentially related to social distancing, right? If we know how many people are in the store, because we can track that, that's the data insight we have, we could actually put this layer on it and look at it from the point of view of societal good and say, what cities are getting busy? Are they busier now in these like confined spaces than they were, 3 weeks ago? What does that tell us about even predictions about where there's going to be more spread of the pandemic? So we don't deal for this client with health and wellness at all, but that piece of data is interesting because one, we just added value to the story. We know in Houston or Phoenix or LA or Miami or other hotspots around the US, or even around the world, we also know, to what extent maybe are people social distancing more or less, but it also ladders back directly to our brand's core value and positioning, which is there is tremendous insight to be gained for understanding who's going in your store, how they got there, and how that connects to many other things you do as a business. So all of those stories that we're placing also have to talk about how does our client have this data, and we get to talk about our core value and our positioning. So great data spans both. And that's really the art of it, of how you do it. And why is data useful? I think it's to the questioners. I think, Laura, your first comment about there's so much noise and so much competition and all of that. Data just breaks through it. Why? Because it's a little bit harder to get. And it's not as hard as you think, because we do a lot of these data stories and we spend like, a few hours on the data and then use it to pitch a story and we get coverage. But it cuts through everything because it gives you something that separates you from the crowd, that is valuable, and data is often in short supply. So that's the first thing, is that what I would say, and just to go back to the new rule, to get more coverage, package more data, if we work in PR, and we're going to especially see this over the next 5 years, we actually are data packagers. We're packaging news and packaging stories. So in effect, we are creating news, right? We're creating news that is useful to the end audience. And one of the fastest, most powerful ways to do that is with data. Brings us to new rule number 2, which is great PR leads to great Google rankings. And this is something that I don't think the PR industry overall has caught with. There's pockets of people who do a lot with SEO, and certainly there's a few agencies that prioritize this. But I often don't think people realize how closely PR and SEO are tied together in search engine optimization. And if you're listening and you don't know a ton about SEO, let me give you like the 20-second version, which is that obviously search engine optimization refers to getting high in rankings in Google, and specifically without buying that position, by doing it organically. And historically, one of the things that made Google special, which includes till to this today, is their primary way that you can increase your Google rankings fast, is that Google, back in sort of the .com boom, was the first to realize that one of the great ways to tell if you are important and they should put you high up in the rankings is the number of people who link to you and how popular those people were. So it becomes actually, a big like high school popularity contest, right? On the internet. It's like, who's the really popular people? Did they link to me? And so because of, and I'll put this on the screen, PR is a powerful tool for search engine optimization because it can build inbound links at a much faster cadence than traditional methods. So traditional methods, and we also have a big SEO practice, and this is the traditional or the old way for SEO, is that you go out there and you look for, let's say guest blog opportunities where you get a link. So you say, hey, I'll write the story for you. Let me put a link. I'll give you free content, and I'll link back and I'll get a link. Or you might say, let's do a link exchange in some way, although that's somewhat limited because you actually need sort of an asymmetrical exchange. You don't want to have to link to them and they link to you. So what you might do is typically you might say for SEO, you might say, okay, you link to us and we'll post on social media for you. So that way it's a little bit asymmetrical. You get the link, you don't have to link back. That helps SEO. So these are all sort of traditional SEO tactics. Those are, as you can imagine, as I describe them, it's often time consuming. You go one by one. It's a little bit harder to scale. So some of those SEO agencies that do this, if you use this traditional method, you'll be like, yeah, we got 10 this month, 10 new inbound links. Fantastic. Congratulations. High fives. That's amazing. We got 10. And now those of you who work in PR though, know that if we get a great story, if we have one that has it's very timely and it's very relevant and it's interesting. And in our language, what we call it's the 3 S's: simple, surprising, and significant. If we do a story like that, we can, and particularly we often use it with a data story, we'll get 300 hits, in the next 2 weeks. So, and a hit meaning a media placement. So the difference is traditional SEO gets 10, they're high-fiving. PR does a great story, gets 300. And so because of that ability to generate links, PR is one of the most powerful weapons in the search engine optimization toolbox. And so if you're a PR person, you're a professional now, it would be wise to learn as much as you can about SEO. Beyond that, though, what it really means is that 2 sides of the marketing house need to talk if you're at a brand or you're in a house. And not only do they need to talk, but it's actually 2 different types of thinkers. If the PR side comes a little bit more of the sort of like creative thinker, the SEO side tends to be a little bit more of the analytical thinker. And so we've actually need both. We need left brain, we need right brain to do this well. So that's really powerful, and thinking and understanding about that. And so what that does is it brings in a whole new class of metrics. We start looking at the number of do follow links we generate. What does do follow mean? It means it counts for Google, but there actually may be some thinking that actually even no follow links actually still may help in some capacity. So we can discuss that. It means we start looking at the domain authority, which is just, how popular a site is on a 100-point scale. And how do we get media outlets that have high domain authority? As we start rolling out local campaigns, it starts impacting that, because suddenly if we can scale local PR efforts, we'll have high domain authority in local markets from the media that are in those markets. So that shifts how we approach local and national. So this is a pretty big change overall. And the good news for anyone who is a PR practitioner is you just became a lot more relevant and important and valuable. And I don't think everyone in the PR industry realizes that if you do PR, you're also doing SEO. Brings us to the next point. And Jackson, before we go on, any other additional questions or comments on sort of the first 2, 1 related to data and 2 related to SEO?
Yeah, Ben, I think there are a couple here that are worth addressing. The first from Lance Buckley, he says, my team does so many surveys, but they don't always deliver the desired ROI. And he wonders if you have any advice on how to package surveys to help garner more interest from media. And I think this may play into kind of, story blueprints, right? Which I don't know, we may have a chance to get into a little more later. And then sort of another question as we're talking about scalability. I mean, we're talking about, 300 hits, right? We're talking about some really massive success. And I was wondering if you could also speak to, Laura had a follow-up question asking, in your early years, how much of your success was based on having the right contact? Were you using published lists like Incision, or were you really just using your own research to find the right people? So I think that both of those are questions that might be worth addressing as we go forward. I know that we'll touch on both of those later in the presentation as well.
Okay, sure. Well, let me do a short answer for both of those, and I'll do a longer answer on, as you know, probably new rule number 3 is going to help us answer this. But those are great questions. So 1, on just the survey question, I actually have 2 answers for you, which is 1, you need to write the survey with the end result in mind, and 2, don't rely just on surveys. So the first answer is that when we do surveys and we're actually crafting the questions, we do this across all of our agencies, and we have one of our agencies is called Top Data that specifically works on data packaging. We're a market research agency, and so we can certainly help anyone with this if they need some advice or help. But one of the things we do as we write the questions is we write the headline that we want to get from the question. And we're sort of adamant that we have to write that headline. And what that does is it instills a discipline. We're not just asking a question because this is our PhD thesis or dissertation, and we want to get an interesting like we want to find necessarily the truth of the topic. I mean, we like learning things and having insights, but that's not the fundamental goal. The fundamental goal is to generate media coverage. And so because of that, we'll say we are asking this question and we are having these choices because we want to be able to write a headline, and we write it on our survey when we're drafting it, that we want to get to this headline. And what that does is it really focuses you on, okay, am I asking this question for what reason, and what will be the end result from doing this? So it makes your survey a lot better. So that's number 1. Number two, don't rely just on surveys. So we are using a tremendous amount of Google search trends. So we did a story I mentioned earlier about the most stressed out states with COVID-19. We didn't run a survey on that. We just simply looked at searches for topics in Google Trends that indicate stress. And we compared them state by state to create a ranking. Or what's another data source we use? It was not a survey, where we recently did a story using Indeed.com's API on job postings, because we actually did the job creation index, and we used it as a counterpoint. So saying, can we predict unemployment numbers and if they're getting better or getting worse based on to what extent companies are generating new job posts? And we actually, it was really interesting. And we did this for top data for ourselves. I was doing these TV interviews all across the country. We actually predicted that unemployment in the US would be better than expected 2 to 3 weeks before everyone did, because we could see the jobs being created and we saw that it started trending up in May. And so it actually was really interesting that. So short answer is, one, you got to write your surveys with the headlines in mind, and two, don't rely just on surveys. And then I think to the other question about just media lists and contacts and all that, one of the best ways that we get great relationships, and we believe in great media relationships, is actually we give them great stories. So what happens is when you give great stories over a period of time and you become known for great stories, then you start to naturally develop a relationship with the journalist, because they're like, that's great. Can you give me this? Do you have more insight on that? Do you have a bit of data here? You start trading, cell phone numbers. We have an initiative right now in the agency, which is don't just rely on email addresses. Let's, at PR Hacker, let's get cell phone numbers of everyone. And so we can start texting pitches together. So you start doing that, you start building relationships. So I think a great story actually is the best relationship builder you have. And in terms of what we do, we have a whole, we call it, our PR engine. Currently one PR engine 2.0, 3.0 is coming out soon. And we actually have our own proprietary data that we've pulled from lots of different sources, lots of databases that you might buy, but over time it's sort of become our own as we've added to it. So let me jump in to number 3. And Jackson, how are we doing on time here? Just so we can get through this and allow for some time for questions at the end.
Yeah, I think we're doing all right, Ben. It's currently 3:45 Central, just so you kind of benchmark there.
Okay, great. So let me just kind of give you quickly a little schematic. And by the way, I'm going to give you an address where you can kind of sign up to download the presentation. So, I mean, you can take screenshots on your computer, but there's an address I'll give you where you just kind of fill a little form, and we'll send you the presentation, and we'll send you some of the blueprints as well. So you can get this later. But basically, how to use PR to create links. We talked about the power for SEO. So one, this is people most often forget step number 1, which is leverage a timely news peg. It's not just data. If we're doing a data study, just because we find it's interesting, it's like, how is it relevant right now? You start with that news peg. Number 2, you create that data study. Like I said, it's not always a survey. 3, you post that study on your website. 4, you pitch that data story to mass media. So you pitch it to different media outlets. 5, the media links to the full data study. And then 6, you get inbound traffic, and you get SEO in the form of those links that have high domain authority and that do follow. So that's kind of how you implement that in process. Brings us to point number 3, or I say new rule number 3, which is PR is more scalable with pitch blueprints. So this addresses the question, I think, Lance, that you had about like, how do we get more like ROI and effectiveness from this? I'm going to show about how you start packaging stories in ways that journalists can recognize them as stories. And also how this makes PR more scalable, because the issue is that when you have a breaking trend and you can't wait 24 hours to pitch it, and you've got to pitch it now and it's just breaking, the blueprints help you scale those pitches a little bit faster. So let me give you an idea of what I mean by these pitch blueprints. Here's one example. So every pitch blueprint we have starts with a code name. So we call this geo-ranking. And it's just a shorthand for our team to be able to start discussing and brainstorming. We call it structured creativity. Because if you provide a structure, it doesn't impede your creativity, it enhances it. Because why? Because you don't have to worry about the blocking and tackling of how this is going to work. You can focus on the message and the story and the idea. So geo-ranking is based around a question. So all of our blueprints have a question. In this case is, how can we compare different regions to each other to generate local news at global scale? And so we basically are going to create a local headline that we can scale all across the country or all across the world. So let me give you an example. When I mentioned what were the most stressed out US states, which was a pitch we did, is California number 1? Is Florida number 2? Is Tennessee number 3? So what we resulted in, so this is a way of packaging a story that a journalist will recognize, oh, this is interesting because I can see the comparative relationship between local areas. And when we pitch it, if we're pitching a journalist in Houston, we're going to give them Houston's ranking on our index. So it has the added benefit of being very locally relevant. So if we have, if one, it's already timely, and two, it's locally relevant, but it has context beyond the location, this is really powerful as a geo-ranking blueprint. So very famous award-winning campaign we did was for Milkbone. We did a campaign and it was called the Doggy Love Index, and it actually ranked which states love their dogs the most. And so we gave each state a local number that we could pitch locally, but then we could do it at scale across the country. And that was an example of a geo-ranking that generated the equivalent of a Super Bowl ad worth of exposure, even though it was entirely earned media. Okay, another blueprint, predictor. So predictor blueprint, how can we make a logical prediction about what will happen at an upcoming event? So we think companies, if they want to generate news, should be in the prediction business, and particularly if they want to be perceived as a market leader. Why? Because market leaders get to make predictions. One of our clients, another client of ours is AAA. So AAA it makes predictions on what? On like how many drivers are going to be on the road on Memorial Day and Labor Day, right? And that reaffirms that they're a market leader in understanding auto travel. So how can we make a logical prediction? So we'll use it and we'll based on data and we'll use it to do things. So for instance, you know, if Apple is coming out with a new device and we're a company that is related to Apple's ecosystem, we might make a prediction about what features are going to be in that device based on what features people want the most. So how can we generate news by looking ahead? That's a totally different blueprint, which is a predictor. Or a battlefield. So a battlefield blueprint is how can we explain our industry in terms of a warlike battle that is filled with drama and intrigue. So classic example of this is we could do a story about, you know, who has more market share, Coca-Cola or Pepsi. But instead, if we frame this as this is the cola wars, and this is an incredible battle, and why did Pepsi, you know, when the Super Bowl was in Atlanta, come into Coke's hometown and buy up every billboard in town and put Pepsi on it just to piss off Coke? Why would they do that, right? It's an intriguing story. And so I think, Lance, to your question earlier about how do we get more ROI from some of these surveys we're doing, you need to start not only writing the headline in advance, but to start structuring them in terms of blueprints. So if you know that you're going to do the battlefield blueprint for a story, you might need to ask questions that more talk about head to head and what is that battle. Or if you want to do geo-ranking later and you're doing that survey, you're like, okay, we're going to need local results. So do we have enough survey sample size so that we can compare local regions to each other? Or if you're doing the predictor blueprint, maybe we need to ask people what they want or what they expect. So hopefully that starts to show how you can make a more relevant survey that's a better story by thinking in terms of these blueprints. And finally, the last one I'll give you is big number. So how can you sum up individual benefits to create an impressive statistic of aggregate impact? So let's make big numbers and let's use that to generate news. So how do you do that? Well, for instance, let's say your product or your app, we'll say it's something related to productivity. Let's say it saves people, 5 hours a week, right? From something common that you do. Well, let's create a big number by aggregating that and saying like, well, how much, if everyone in London did this, how many hours of time could we save the people of London? That's a big number because we've taken this individual thing and we've aggregated it. Or let's not do geographical, let's do another one. Let's say, if that 5 hours of productivity time you could save, how would that affect the real estate industry? If every real estate agent actually benefited from these 5 hours of savings per week, how much time would that free up in productivity? So big numbers are ways that we take individual benefits and aggregate them to more impact. And that's another way to create a news that a journalist would recognize as this is a valuable story. Okay, brings us to new rule number 4. Work laterally instead of sequentially. And the old way of doing this we talked about a little bit about a sequential process, largely because the roots of PR are based on the press release, which is a sequential discipline. And like I said before, the press release got its start specifically because it was a big event like a train crash, and there needed to be an official source of truth. of the company's position on this train crash. And it was a very effective deliverer of that position that other people saw it and they started using it. And so a press release now, and we do a lot of them, and we put a lot of effort into writing really, really good press releases that have different viral triggers in them. It has different like possible headlines for journalists. We do a lot with how do we create a press release that will lead to a lot of social sharing. We do all of those things, but the primary purpose usually is not to like build awareness from the press release. It's to have an official record, a source of truth for the company. So by working laterally, let me give you an example and show you how you can increase the odds of expanding your PR placement. So let me kind of show you what I call the math of data-driven PR. So first of all, let's say that we use one of our predictor blueprints. I talked about making prediction of the future, and we pitch, we're just going to use a mathematical example. We're going to pitch, 700 contacts in the Bay Area because it's a locally relevant story to the Bay Area. Let's say it's a, tech story related to Silicon Valley. And if we assume a super low conversion rate, right? Like I'm doing like, this is low, right? This is like baseline for marketing. Like if you do direct mail, they often say like 1% is baseline. So that means that if we pitch 700 contacts with our sort of predictor blueprint story at a 1% conversion rate, we're gonna get 7 media hits. Now, let's say we take another blueprint we have, which is called Think Small, which is all about talking about small niche industries that we can generate news and data for. So let's use our Think Small blueprint and let's pitch that out to the tech vertical. So there's 5,000 quality tech media contacts. We do that with the story at a 1% conversion rate. Again, low, we want to be higher than 1%, but let's just say it's real low. That's 50 media placements if we pitched all 5,000. Now, third, let's take our geo-ranking blueprint I just talked about, right? Which was like the kind of the local news ordinal rankings that we can do all over. And let's pitch metro news outlets that. So there's 7,000 media contacts that would cover this local news across the country at a 1% conversion rate. That's 70 media placements. And finally, one of our blueprints that made us famous, the disease blueprint, I talked a little bit about it when I talked about the 72% of Americans are compulsive gadget hoarders. Compulsive gadget hoarding was the disease. If we take that pitch and we go to business contacts, that's 9,000 media contacts at a 1% conversion rate. That's 90 media hits. So my point in working laterally instead of sequentially is that if we were predominantly doing this through a press release format, we would do not all 4 of these kind of pitches and blueprints at the same time. We do them one at a time. We do Bay Area for a bit, then we do tech for a bit, then we do metro news for a bit, then we do business. But by working laterally and actually having these be parallel tracks, then suddenly not only do we really increase our odds of success. So one, now we can expect at a 1% conversion rate, 217 media hits. But two, we compress the time because we're working laterally. So we're going to get those hits faster. That becomes really relevant for any company that cares about growth, right? Because you want your growth to not look like this. You want it to look like a hockey stick, like a J curve. So that becomes the new way of thinking about PR is how can we get lateral story tracks in parallel, not sequential. And here's another way to look at it. If we want to get coverage in the New York Times, and that's our goal, suddenly if we can pitch the Bay Area correspondent and the tech vertical and the metro news vertical and across the country and the business vertical, suddenly we can pitch 40 reporters and editors of the New York Times instead of 5 if we only focused on 1. So the key to unlocking data-driven PR is to make it rapidly scalable, and you can make it rapidly scalable by working laterally instead of sequentially. That increases and improves your scale. And Jackson, I'm going to jump into the kind of final points here, and then kind of the most important thought of the day. But any kind of final wrap-up questions, or should I just kind of proceed? Because I know we're a little bit short on time.
Sure. A couple of just like really brass tacks questions. Julia's wondering what tools you recommend for surveys. I've actually seen this question a couple of times. Like is it SurveyMonkey, Google surveys, etc. And then Laura also was wondering if some of the numbers that you were using previously are like assuming basically all email pitching.
Okay,
or whether
sure.
Conversion rates is doing something else.
Okay, sure. A couple of things. So one, in terms of the question about like kind of tools and things like that, there's many different things we use. One of the things that actually a lot of people don't know about in terms of many of these survey tools is that a lot of them can be free to use actually if you have your own panel. What I mean is that you have your own people to survey. So if you have access to a pocket of people that you can survey, they can actually be very economical. For Top Data, which is our market research company, we use our own proprietary tools that we built for this purpose. But what I would say is that whatever tool you use, and there's a wide range that I think, what is an expected sort of cost for that tool? Very common would be at the sort of affordable range would be like maybe $1 per respondent. If it's a little bit more focused audience, $1.50 or something like that. So you should be looking in that range. We're pretty, like a lot of tools are pretty even in our book. There are some lower sort of cost ones. If you want to look at like, I mean, obviously SurveyMonkey is very well known. There are others like Survey Gizmo that are a little bit of like kind of less expensive kind of version of that might be a little bit more accessible to more people. We're using our own proprietary tool, but I would sort of say the key is I would sort of say try a lot of tools. And the number one thing I'd sort of say to do that is the analytical tools they provide will make life a lot easier for you for analyzing the data. So if they let you do a lot of like sort of cross analysis and you can segment it easily and you can like break it down geographically, that will save you more time, and I sort of choose on that basis. To the second question, I think we had the question about, and Jackson, remind me, we had the question, I think from Laura about, does this assume email pitching that we're doing? It's one of the ways we pitch, but it's not just that. So we have multiple methods. So we have one method that we call scalable stories, which is basically a personalized email approach. But it's not just email, because we will follow up via Twitter, and we will follow up via LinkedIn, or we will initially pitch via LinkedIn or Twitter, or and then we will also call, but we call when we sort of see evidence that the journalist is interested. So if we see them like open an email pitch or click on something, then we'll trigger a phone call. So that's scalable stories. Second method we have is rapid response. Rapid response says we'll look at all the journalists, what they're already writing, and if someone's writing about autonomous vehicles, we'll respond to that story. So that is a separate approach where what we'll do is, and it can be, it can be social media, it can be phone calls, it can be emails, but basically we'll respond to what they're doing. It's very reactive. And then the third method we have is called top relationships. And top relationships says we're going to look at these, like this body of 40 journalists that we're going to really focus on a special time to. So I think email is a very scalable approach and is generally, probably now how people like to be contacted, probably more so than phone. But that doesn't mean, some people are phone people, and some people, I actually think the gold standard is we ought to be texting more pitches. If we can get those kind of phone numbers, it's a lot more effective to break through the noise. So all of those are different methods, but the key is to sort of be able to do it at greater scale and at greater speed. Brings us to my kind of final point, and then I'll give you like my biggest thought of the day. And the final new rule, new rumble number 5, is that competitor coverage is good for you. So a lot of times, and we do a lot of like share of voice studies and reports where we're looking at like, how does our voice match up with our competitors? If all of the, all of the discussion on topic is the whole pie, what is our slice of the pie? We also do something called share of mind that not a lot of agencies do. What share of mind is looking at to what extent, if there's like, 1,000 journalists we want to know about us or our company, to what extent do all of them know about us, they're aware? To what extent do they understand what we do? To what extent do they have a positive impression of our company? So that doesn't even involve media hits, that involves just share of mind of the people we need to influence, the journalists. But as we do those things, there is this sort of sense like, oh man, the competitor got this, they've got, like, how are they getting all this PR and we didn't? And so what I would encourage you to start thinking about is actually competitor coverage can be good for you if you leverage it the right way. And so we call this the slingshot. And what the slingshot is basically, in the little sort of graphic here is like a spaceship going around, let's say a planet, and accelerating from the gravitational pull of that planet. It's how, if you saw the movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks, he executes one of these. Matt Damon in The Martian needs to get home from Mars. He is one of these. And so the idea is that when competitors show us which journalists will cover them, will cover the topic, they've just done half of the work for us. Thank you for letting us know who will cover this topic. And we can go in and in a quick and agile way, approach that journalist, have a related story or a data study or a new angle, and sort of conquest that journalist every time a competitor is mentioned. So what we do as an agency for our clients is, one, we'll look at the past 12 months of coverage for that competitor and say, who are all the, 1,700 journalists covered all our competitors. And then we'll at scale approach all of them to start increasing share of mind. And then two, we'll start monitoring this on an ongoing basis. So what you sort of need in this sort of new world order of PR is you need like a proactive news creating process. That's the blueprints. But then you also need this reactive rapid response process. That's the defense. And we can do that for the slingshot. Or another example is we call the Goliath. So the Goliath says, let's use large Goliath companies in our industry to raise our profile. So for instance, maybe you're not maybe you're a startup with a kind of a new tech solution and you're not nearly as big as Samsung, but Samsung generates a tremendous amount of news because lots of people cover what Samsung does. So if you can start monitoring what Samsung does related to you and then insert yourself in their story, you can leverage the news they generate. And a good example with this would be, and let's say, and these are like kind of the iconic companies, whether it's like a General Motors or it's a Tesla or it's a Facebook or it's an Apple, or it's a Berkshire Hathaway because Warren Buffett's covered, or it's a Bank of America or Wells Fargo and financial services. There are certain companies that generate a lot of news. And if you can enter their story by providing insight, analysis, or data, you can be covered. And here's the cool part. So there are beat reporters at major publications assigned to these companies. There's a beat reporter, at the Wall Street Journal that's assigned, multiple that are assigned to Apple. So if they're focused on Apple and you're not Apple, they're not going to cover you. But suddenly, if you have some insight that is relevant to coverage of Apple, they absolutely could feature you. So the good news here is basically it increases the number of journalists you can pitch if you deploy the Goliath, because suddenly all of these coverage that's built around these big brands can be brought in for what you need as well. And so here's the wrap up. And Jackson, I love getting tweets and things like that. The wrap up, I'm going to end with my most important thought of the day. But my first question for you, because we like to know which ideas are most simple, surprising, and significant, which are sticky, is what is the one thing in this webinar today that was most interesting, surprising, or you can use tomorrow? Please let me know. Tweet at me at Benjamin Kaplan. We'll respond and let us know what is that kind of one thing, and this is actually a great exercise for your PR pitches as well, which is, sometimes I think PR pitches, I call it the multi-topic combo meal. You're just like, let's throw all this stuff in this pitch. It's all of these ideas, all of these stories all in one, and then you don't even have one idea that really comes through. So in this case, I want to know from this webinar, was it useful? Of course, I hope it was. And then what is the one thing? Tweet at me at Benjamin Kaplan. Second, a little bit of a networking growth hack, and you can do this now, is I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. So that is my LinkedIn address on the screen, but if you want to be kind of super tech savvy here, you can hold up your phone. So get your phone out if you have the LinkedIn app. Go in your search bar to that little QR code that's in the search bar and click it. And then basically there's an option there to either show your QR code or scan a QR code. And maybe a lot of us know a lot more about QR codes now because we're using them at like the restaurants for menus and stuff like that and other things, and sort of when we're not paper-based. So what you can do though is choose that in your LinkedIn app, and this is a great way to exchange information. Click on the little QR code icon in the search bar and hold up your phone to the screen. And if you hold it up to the screen and you hold it up right now on my QR code, you're going to be taken to my page. Put in a request and say you were at the webinar, and I'll accept the request. And then finally, if there's other issues you want to talk through, this is my email address, one of them, at PR Hacker, ben.kaplan@prhacker.com. Shoot me an email there. If we can help with your survey, love to help. If we could help with how you get better intermediate coverage, we'd love to help. We'd of course love to have you as a client, but even if it's more of a consultory role, we can sort of help and probably save you a lot of time and money in how to approach that. Email me, ben.kaplan@prhacker.com. And then finally, before I end on the final thought of the day, today's slides we have for you so that you can remember something you might have forgotten. If you want to share it with your team, you can. And this is the address to go. Go to events.benkaplan.com and then the /new-rules-of-PR, and then fill out the short form there, and then we will send you today's presentation. You'll have some of the blueprints in them as well, and we'll add some additional blueprints to the presentation so you can get kind of a nice suite of sort of action blueprints you can use, and I hope that will be useful as well. And finally, I should actually say, if you search for it, I probably should put in the deck here, but on YouTube, I have a YouTube channel, and we create a lot of webinars, but also other tutorials. And so if this was useful to you, go on the YouTube channel, and maybe Jackson, if you can sort of find that and kind of post it in the room. I probably should have put it in the deck today, but then I think, a lot of ongoing webinars and stuff, you can subscribe on the YouTube channel. And I think probably subscribing on the YouTube channel is one of the fastest ways to kind of stay up to date. And if you just want to Google this and you don't want to deal with that, you could just Google, here's a simple way, Google Ben Kaplan, YouTube, pivot, don't pause, because that was one of the presentations that's on there. And then you'll be taken to my YouTube channel and you can subscribe. So Jackson, any final questions or thoughts of the day on your end? Otherwise, I'll wrap up with my most important piece of advice for the new rules of PR.
Yeah, Ben, I think we are about out of time. I think we've gotten to most of the questions. So I think we're good to wrap up. If we didn't get to your question today, be sure to send a note to Ben either on LinkedIn or Twitter, or of course via email. And I'll also be linking to the YouTube channel here in the chat in just a moment.
Okay, yep, that's great. And let me, sounds great. Thank you everyone for joining us. And I should give a preview. Next week, we haven't announced it yet, but we're gonna actually be doing, next week's webinar is gonna be on the new rules of influencer marketing. So if you're interested in also deploying, and we're doing, an increasing amount of influencer marketing. If you look at the growth curve of influencer marketing on like Google Trends, you'll see it be like, just go like this, like in terms of number of searches about influencer marketing. So there's a whole new world order in influencer marketing. We're going to talk about that next week. And in particular, some of the new rules involve the fact that actually a lot of the work for influencers has dried up during the pandemic. So if you want to jump into influencer marketing and you have work for influencers, there's a lot more possibilities and opportunities for all sorts of deals, partnerships. You can strike organic earned media you can get with the influencers as well. So that's going to be topic for next week. Stay tuned for the announcement on that. And the best way, of course, is to subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. And we'll do the new rules of influencer marketing next week. So let me end on kind of the final thought of the day, which is this. What is most striking about the new rules of PR is that we as practitioners of PR are incredibly valuable. What we do by like honing a message, understanding how to communicate a message at its best, I think impacts every other marketing discipline. Yet at times, PR is kind of considered like, oh, it's not as rigorous or not as quantitative, or I can't track it as well as other disciplines. So the lesson for everyone here today is that earned media with PR leading the way at its best has the highest ROI of any marketing discipline. Specifically because unlike paid advertising, when you stop paying that dollar to get the ad, you're not going to get any benefit. PR, in terms of the positioning of your company and stories that live on the internet forever, can pay dividends long after you spend that dollar or put in that hour of effort. So I do believe that the golden age of PR is coming, and we're at the start of it now because of how valuable it is in all of this noise to have credible insights, credible voices, authentic stories, real news, data-driven. But the tools we do and the thinking that we need to do to execute that needs to change. So PR is valuable. Earned media has more ROI than ever before. We've got to kind of think differently and think in a new way. And hopefully this webinar is a start in doing that. I'm going to continue to expand on this presentation and others. And thank you all for coming. I wish you that kind of success, and I would love to hear how you're implementing the new rules of PR. Thank you very much.